Hi, this is Craig Phillips, and today I'd like to talk with you a little bit about global positioning systems and the traveler with a visual impairment. We're going to address the questions who, what, where, why, and how. But before we begin, I'd like to thank Dr. Ann Nielsen of the KANLOVKIDS project for giving me the opportunity to talk with you about GPS. We live in Kansas City, and Kansas City is a very wonderful place to live. We have the Whole Person, an organization that serves people with disabilities and helps them lead independent lives. We're known for barbecue, and we have a number of barbecue restaurants all over Kansas City. Three of our more prominent museums are the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, the World War I Museum, and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, here pictured with the shuttlecock on the south lawn. Kansas City is also home to the first outdoor shopping center in the lower right-hand corner, which in Kansas City is called the Plaza. Now I show you these pictures not to give you an overall view of Kansas City, although it's a nice place to live, but to talk with you about using GPS. If the traveler with a visual impairment was using a GPS device, he or she would have the ability to go to any one of these locations on their own. They might walk, take a bus, hire a cab, ask a friend to take them, but they would have the ability to go there all by themselves. Berthold Lowenfeld, the former superintendent of the California School for the Blind, says that blindness imposes the following limitations: the loss of the range and variety of experiences, the loss of the ability to get about, and the loss of the control of the environment and the self in relation to it. My colleague at Missouri State University calls it Ehresmann's theory of relativity. And he says you are only as independent as your relatives allow you to be. I would posit that many of our clients and students have very little control to go places independently because their relatives do not allow them to go there. So using a GPS device fosters the orientation skills to travel independently in the environment. The law is very supportive in using technology to accommodate for the loss of vision. Two landmark laws are something that you all need to be well versed in. Educating Blind and Visually Impaired Students, published in the Federal Register on June 8, 2000, outlines the parameters of educating children who are blind and visually impaired. Assistance to States for the Education of Children with Disabilities and Preschool Grants for Children with Disabilities was published in the Federal Register on August 14, 2006, and it is the parameters of the reauthorization of IDEA 2004. Data is far more important than your opinion when you seek to get GPS device for any of your students or clients. I have a friend of mine who is an educational psychologist, and he always says that data will always trump opinion in an argument. And in the picture we have three fellas who are sitting in a bar. And one of them says to the other one, "Are you just pissing and moaning, or can you verify what you're saying with data?" In our case with GPS, can you verify that the student can reorient themselves in the environment? How long does it take? How many attempts? How difficult is it for a student to reach a destination in the environment? So you need to take clear and concise data to demonstrate the need for a GPS device. So why is GPS important? Well, Paul Poncilia at Western Michigan University did some research, and he found that using accessible GPS resulted in the participants reorienting 8 times faster, finding locations twice as fast, and locating targets with a 95% success rate compared to 10% success without GPS assistance. Have accurate data. Preparation for using GPS in the environment on O&M lessons is no different than any other O&M lesson. We use positional concepts, we use compass orientation, and as a side note, Braille compasses are no longer being made in the United States. So if you have one, hold on to it. We talk about landmarks, we talk about context clues, we use visual maps for those who have adequate vision, and we use tactile maps. I like to use the Wheatley or Tactile Town or Swell Paper maps or Collage Braille maps. And I found a high correlation between understanding the environment tied in with the GPS information as a student gains more and more success in the environment. There are some facts about GPS that you need to have and need to know, and your students love these kind of details. The first GPS satellite was launched in 1978. It was built to last about 10 years. It weighs approximately 2,000 pounds, and it's 17 feet across with solar panels to supply the power. Satellites orbit 12,000 miles above the Earth. And that's important to remember because we're going to talk about resolution later on in the presentation. But considering from outer space, and having the satellites 12,000 miles above us, we are no more than a grain of sand. So we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about accuracy. There are 24 satellites constantly moving around the Earth. 2 complete orbits are done in less than 24 hours, and the satellites travel at speeds of roughly 7,000 miles an hour. On the screen is a schematic of how this system works. In the center is the Earth, and surrounding it are 24 satellites in 6 orbital planes with 4 satellites in each plane. The accuracy resolution is plus or minus 50 feet, what may cause the frustration of the final 50 feet. It works in any weather conditions. It works anywhere in the world. There are no subscription fees or setup charges to access GPS, and the system works 24 hours a day. Signals travel by line of sight. They can go through clouds, glass, and plastic, but they cannot go through most solid objects such as buildings and mountains. Therefore, we don't get good GPS inside of a classroom. It's to be used outside. Triangulation occurs when you have at least 3 satellites to calculate a 2D position. That is, latitude and longitude, and is necessary to track movement. When you have 4 or more satellites to calculate a 3D position, which will give you latitude, longitude, and altitude, as well as track movement. Pictured on the screen is an individual with a handheld GPS receiver. Outer space, there are 4 satellites looking at him. They communicate via electronics, and then the algorithms inside the device calculate the exact position in space based upon the latitude and longitude which are on the memory of the device itself. So therefore, it would announce then where you are in space through those calculations. When we work with students, there are certain things that you must have in place to make this work. Primarily is interest. I was at the O&M conference recently in New Orleans, and Mickey D'Amelio from Florida State University was talking about creating what he calls a curious learner. And that interest, that curiosity about the world around them is real critical to get acceptance of GPS. The other important is perceived utility. If the student doesn't see themselves ever using it, they're not going to embrace the technology. Maturity is far more important than age. I like to start with my students at age 3, and many people have asked me, well, gee, that seems awfully young. It's not to develop instant knowledge of the world, but to begin to have our students get used to the concept of getting auditory information and then having the control to determine if they are going to use it or not. Some students are very mature at age 3, others are not, and you have to gauge the maturity, but it's far more important than age. Cognitive ability is very important to understand the schemes that we are using in the environment and how the auditory information relates to the environment. Dexterity is important because the devices and apps use our fingers. There has been, I should say, an auditory device that has been used in the field, but pretty much that has gone by the wayside. So dexterity is very important, as well as the concept of a route. What is a route? What are we trying to do here? Going from point A to point B or beyond. And then, of course, the stamina to walk that route is very important. And I've had students that are not techies and embrace GPS. I've had students that are big-time techies and absolutely love it. But techiness is useful, but it certainly is not essential. There are essential GPS features that must be on any device or app to make it applicable for the traveler with a visual impairment. Number 1 is turn-by-turn, block-by-block route directions. Another is that it automatically announces the position in space and direction of travel before and after each route segment. Another automatic announcement has to be the upcoming intersection type and if it's a roundabout. So it would tell us if it is a 4-way intersection, a 3-way intersection, or a roundabout that we are approaching. Another essential feature is that pedestrian routes are created for distance, whereas motorized routes are created for quickness or time to get there. It is important to have a built-in pedometer in the device. We get a lot of physical education credits from the amount of distances we walk by using that pedometer information. And very important is off-route detection and route correction within a city block. The old days, it would be 3 blocks before the device would tell you that you were off route. Now, the devices are fine-tuned to the point of we get that information within a city block. It's essential that the device tells us what's around us in the environment, near, under 500 feet or 300 meters, and give us information that is further out in the environment, beyond those 300 meters or 500 feet if we access it. It must automatically announce points of interest, landmarks, and waypoints when we are in pedestrian mode. And we're going to define points of interest, landmarks, and waypoints later on. It must also announce landmarks and waypoints when we are in motorized mode. It cannot also announce POIs because there is too much information and we're moving too fast through the environment when we're in motorized route to get that out. But whenever we consider using a device with a student, we must always consider the student first and ourselves second. Mike May, the individual who invented GPS for the blind and visually impaired, says that the difficulty or simplicity of learning how to use a system must work for the student first and the teacher second. It's not about you. I am not as well versed with some devices as others because of the being able to use it and practice on it. If it is a standalone device, I have more chance to play with it and work with it. But if it is a device like the Apex, that's going to be in the student in class with my students because it ties into a Braille note taker. So we have to always consider the student first, and that's where we begin. The devices that I'm very familiar with and work with on a regular basis are the Braille Note Apex, made by the Sendero Corporation, the Trekker Breeze, the Seeing Eye GPS app, and the Garmin Oregon 450. Pictured on your screen is the Braille Note Apex, made by Sendero. It is a Braille note taker with a refreshable Braille format, which is really great for the deaf-blind student, and then a Bluetooth receiver to access GPS signals. What's very nice about this device is that it has what is called a primary and secondary voice. Primary voice gives us information, and the secondary voice, Mike calls it his validity voice, that it reaffirms for the traveler that he's doing the correct thing. It has a refreshable Braille display, again for the deaf-blind traveler. It uses a Bluetooth receiver, uses TomTom maps. It is sold by Humanware. It is made by Sendero. And the device, the note taker, as of this recording, comes in at $5,495 plus $599 for the GPS add-on. On your screen is a picture of the Trekker Maestro, which was preceded the Trekker Breeze. And I put this on the screen because if you have one, Humanware will take it in trade if you buy a Trekker Breeze, and they will give you a $200 discount if you turn this in. I gave mine away that I had personally, and my student was able to get that discount, but it's available for everybody. The Trekker Breeze is on the screen. It is a very simple device about the size of a cell phone. What's nice about the Breeze is there are large, distinctive, very tactile buttons. It has a built-in GPS receiver and speaker. It has a secondary external speaker which you can pin onto your collar so you can hear things if the environment is very noisy. It uses Navtech or HERE maps. It has 6 hours of rechargeable battery life. It's made by Humanware, and as of this recording, it's priced at $699. Pictured on your screen is the Seeing Eye GPS app. It is the only app that I've found that I really like the best. There are other apps. The Blind Square app comes in at a close second, but the Seeing Eye GPS app is used on an iOS platform, and it is very well put together. There are buttons for POIs, location, and routes on the lower portion of every screen to access. There are two choices for map data: Foursquare and TomTom. It searches the surrounding near area by pointing the phone. So as you are trying to find out what's around you, you simply point the phone in that direction and it will tell you. It is made by the Sendero Corporation, Mike May's company, and there is a 30-day subscription fee of $9.99, a 3-year subscription fee of $129.99, and a 1-year subscription of $69.99. Pictured on your screen is the Garmin Oregon 450. This is a device that I use quite a lot when I go kayaking. And I like to use it with my low vision students. I think they like to use it because it has a nice colored screen, but also because it comes with a real neat carabiner that my students can clip onto their belt loop, and they think that's pretty cool. It has a color 3-inch diagonal touchscreen. It is WAS enabled, so that means that the receiver plugs into the wide area augmentation system, so it's using satellite information as well as ground-based satellite or receiving towers, and it provides us with a 10 to 20 foot resolution. It has an electronic compass built into the device. It uses NavTech or HERE maps, and it also has a micro SD card slot if you want to add additional maps. When I'm working with a student in a city, I can download those additional maps from the Garmin website for a fee onto the micro SD card, and it provides more layers of information for my students. It is not auditory, although it will beep before a student has to make a turn at an intersection. And I bought mine at REI, but I've seen them available on Amazon and eBay, and generally in the $200 to $300 range. There are 4 stages of learning that occur whenever we're learning anything new. Many of you who are listening to this are watching it and you've never done anything with GPS. You watch this webinar, you come in with no information. So therefore you are unconsciously incompetent. You don't know what you don't know. Hopefully, at the end of watching this presentation, you will become consciously incompetent. You will realize that you don't know anything. And when you're using GPS, it takes about 5 years of a lot of use to reach the next stage of consciously competent. It takes a long time because we have to tie in the information as well as teaching ourselves and our students how to use the device, and then how that interacts with the environment and different environments. And Malcolm Gladwell, in his book The Outliers, talks about what he calls the 10,000 hour theory, and that is it takes about 10,000 hours before we become unconsciously competent. Therefore, we don't think, we just do. And for some of you older people watching this webinar, many times we will be out in schools and we will work with a student and the teacher will say, "Wow, that was neat. I never thought of that." And your answer generally is, "Thought of what?" We've done these things so often working with students that we have reached that unconsciously competent stage. We don't think anymore, we just do. And in Malcolm Gladwell's book, he says that takes approximately 10,000 hours or 10 years of work. And it has taken me about 10 years to really wrap my brain around GPS and how it works. I started working with GPS in 2002, but that was only after I had read Doug Baldwin's work on electronic mobility in the late 90s. In 2002, I had the opportunity to go out and walk with Mike May in Toronto, Canada at an AER conference, and was fascinated that Mike, being totally blind, could walk with his dog guide and point out buildings that this was here, this was there, simply by using the electronic information he was getting through his GPS. So I started in 2002, and as I record this, it is 2015. And I feel that I'm unconsciously competent when I work with GPS. But it has taken a lot of miles and a lot of traveling to get to that point. When you begin working with students, begin at the beginning. Take your time, go slow. Start with the component parts of the device. Take it apart, put it together, and then orient to the device using the key describer mode. Talk about GPS limits and parameters, what GPS can do, what it can't do. GPS will get you close to the destination. Many people have asked me, well, how accurate is it? Well, it depends on the day, it depends on the weather, it depends on how many satellites, depends on how fast we're moving. There are a lot of balls in the air when we think about using this technology. And that's very hard for O&M specialists to think about, because O&M specialists are taught to think in a linear fashion. You do point A to point B to point C to point D, and then you reach a destination. When we are using GPS, we are using information that changes, and as we walk through the environment, it changes. So we have to teach problem-solving mode and what GPS can do and what it can't do. Generally, and I say this often to O&M specialists, all of you can teach a 50-foot route. O&M specialists are certified, the comms, certification. We've all been through the training programs at universities. We know we've got great teaching skills, and we know how to teach the environment. The electronic information is something we have difficult with, but it is something that can be incorporated into your lesson. So we talk about the GPS limits and parameters, and understand that it may not deliver you right to your doorstep, but if you are close, you can get there, because it's important to realize you can always get home with your GPS. Another principle that's hard to understand initially is movement versus static position. When we turn on our device in the environment, GPS has a hard time finding us because we are not moving. Remember, the Earth is moving, so you as a person have to move, and the satellites are moving. And all of that movement goes together to determine your position in space. It doesn't do real well when you just stand in the environment. So movement is always important, and it is far more important than the static position of just standing there. When we start with GPS, we start with the familiar. When you're working with a student, start at their driveway and their sidewalk in front of their house or their doorstep, or if you're working at the school, start at the doorway going out, outside, or the main sidewalk or the main driveway or the door going out to the playground. But start with something familiar so that your students can reference that. so that they know that they are back there, even if the device does not ring them up, as we call it, saying that you have reached your destination. I always tell my students, and I use the old Bob Dylan line, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. That's where the O&M skills that are shoulders up come into play. GPS is nothing more than a tool. Some days the tool is incredibly accurate, some days it isn't. But if we have it built in of the problem-solving ability and knowing what we're looking for, therefore we can start and finish at the same place and not have too much difficulties. As we walk, we want to listen and reference. Learn the language of GPS. Play with the repeat message button. Hear that over and over till we get used to the robotic speech so we understand it. Think always, what is the information and where is it provided as I'm going through space? GPS and robot speech has its own language. When I taught at the Kansas State School for the Blind, I often took my students a block away to work on Minnesota Avenue. Well, GPS does not call it Minnesota. It calls it Minnesota. And I live next to the city of Olathe, Kansas. GPS calls it Olive. And I had a difficult time understanding, what is this Olive? Well, going very slow, I started to understand it was saying Olathe in GPS parlance. And I live in Lenexa, Kansas. GPS would tell you that it is Lenexa. And if you drive down to that shopping area that I talked about on the first slide, the plaza, you drive down Bellevue Avenue. GPS will tell you that you're on Believe You Avenue. And many times my students and I would eat lunch at Panera, also called Panera, or Chipotle, also called Chipotle, and we got used to hearing how the GPS would say different things strangely. I had a student at Rose Hill Elementary School, GPS calls it Rossa Hill. I had a student at Belinder Elementary School, but in GPS would call it Belinder. And the main street very close to my home is called Flum Avenue, but GPS won't even attempt that. It simply calls it PFLUMM Avenue. So practice with the repeat message button so that you get used to seeing how GPS really fractures the pronunciation of words. There are two definitions of the environment when we talk about GPS. You're either on the street or you're in open area. When we talk about street mapping, we know that streets are very ordered. It is either in a grid pattern, a circular pattern. There are numerical reference. The numbers are either odd or even on the east or west, north or south. And the numbers ascend or descend depending on where you are in space. So it's a very ordered environment. On the street, we can get information about POIs, points of interest, landmarks that we place, they're user created, and waypoints, also user created. Open area map is far different. It is amorphous, and it generally starts plus or minus 50 feet from the street, and your GPS device will announce that you are entering open area. You are given directions by clock face to landmarks and waypoints, and you are directed to travel as the crow flies. And by clock face, meaning that 12 o'clock is always in front of you, 9 o'clock is always to your left, 3 o'clock is to your right, and 6 o'clock is behind you. We find this most often in parks, parking lots, playgrounds, beaches, campgrounds, and college campuses. And it is in the open area that we have landmarks and waypoints we, the user, lay down or create in the environment. GPS has no ability to take you from the street to open area or from open area to the street. What it will do is, if you are in open area and want to go to the street, it will tell you get closer to the street and then try again. Say cannot calculate a route, get closer to the street. And O&M specialists always tell their students, just move to the noise. Go to the noise, you hear the traffic, that's where the street is. Now I say that GPS cannot connect the two environments. They cannot be connected unless you have self-created a route going from open area to the street or from street to the open area. Then GPS has recorded you and laid down electronic breadcrumbs so it can take you from one environment to the other. I've spoken about landmarks and waypoints. Those are electronic breadcrumbs that we put in the environment. And then they stay on the SD card or in the memory of the device until you change them or delete them. Multiple landmarks can be set at the same time and same spot. If you are on a spot and you want to say that McDonald's is to my right, the dry cleaners is to my right, and behind me is the drugstore, you can do that all on one spot, and it will record your multiple landmarks. It is important to know, though, when you record landmarks or waypoints, where you are in space. Know that you're in open area or know that you are on the street. And the device, when you ask, where am I, will tell you if you are in open area or on the street. And always set a landmark at the beginning of any journey, no matter where you are going. So therefore you can always get back to that spot, because once you have created a landmark, it does not disappear. It is on the SD card or in the memory, and you can always then access that to set a route so you can always get home. When we create landmarks, pair them with physical reference points. I remember when I first started with GPS and working with a student, we had recorded a landmark in the middle of a 3-car driveway and called that home. Well, we walked around in circles. We knew we were at home. We knew we were there, but we were walking around in circles waiting for the device to tell us that we were there. So I've learned that if we pair it with a physical reference point, maybe the intersection of the sidewalk with the driveway, or the sidewalk that leads to the front door with the intersecting sidewalk, my student knows exactly what they're looking for. GPS got the student close. They didn't need to have them tell them that they are there. They know they're there. So it's very important that we pair with physical reference points. And when we think about making landmarks and waypoints, label them noun first, then adjective. In other words, I would say Smith High School, East Door. I would not do it the other way around, East Door, Smith High School, because I might have more than one East, but I may only have one Smith. And so otherwise, if you were to access that landmark, you would have to go through every East to find Smith High School versus the other way around, where the only one would come up with Smith. Another example is Fraser Hall, front stairs. And a landmark is created when you enter an address. When you create a landmark from entering the civic number and the street and the city. Your address entry results create a landmark. When we use landmarks and waypoints, we are nurturing environmental literacy. So it helps our student then develop the gestalt of the area. If something is not on that map, a POI, we can then lay down a landmark and create one so that we're adding to the environment. Somebody's home is not going to be listed as a point of interest because points of interest are commercial locations. So if we lay down the landmark, then we're adding to the gestalt of the area. And waypoints are what we use to set before hazards, headaches, and irritations. Every time I walk down this street, there seems to be a dog barking when I pass 12th Avenue. Well, I might, before I get to 12th Avenue, set a waypoint and to tell me, beware of that silly barking dog when you're walking north. And when I get to the other side, I would do the same thing. Beware of that silly dog when you're walking south. The important thing is those are waypoints. They give us information along the way as we travel through the environment. We've set waypoints if we have a street that has low-hanging branches on the sidewalk and we keep walking into them. Well, before we get to that street, we might say that that street is coming up. You might want to cross over to the other side of the street so you don't have that difficulty. So set those waypoints before and after hazards, headaches, and irritations. And then with landmarks and waypoints, practice renaming them. We record them out in the environment, and sometimes it's very noisy. We can go back into our devices when we're sitting in a quiet area and rename them. It doesn't change the location, but we can get them more defined in our language. We practice deleting landmarks, and most of the devices will ask you twice, do you really want to delete it, to make sure you don't do it unintentionally. And then unsetting as a destination is what we do with waypoints. We don't want to necessarily walk to that dog, so therefore we would unset that as a destination. So when I'm looking to go to my landmark list, it won't come up as a selection, but it will automatically announce when I pass it. So I identify that landmark / waypoint and then unset it as a destination in the settings menu. A point of interest is just that. They are common locations. They come with the device. They are preset on the maps. You cannot delete them. They are there for all time, and they change over time. Maps are generally updated every year, year and a half, and some of the old locations are not there anymore, because what happens is you may have a location on the map and go to it, but that business is no longer there. So those are all preset on maps. And when we talk about common locations, bus stops, businesses, restaurants, food establishments, government establishments, the type of things that make up our environment. And when we start to use GPS with a student, find a POI-rich environment to begin instruction to demonstrate the utility of the device. So as your student is walking through the environment and it automatically announces all of those points of interest, they then can see how valuable it is to orient to the environment. The only problem with points of interest is we don't know where the spot is, where it's going to ring us up. We know where we're going, but we don't know exactly. I am finding that over time, the spot rings us up on the corner of a building. It rarely rings us up in the middle of a building. And if I am going to a school, it generally rings us up on the main driveway that goes into the school. It doesn't ring us up at the front door. So as you're looking for those destinations and working with a student, kind of build in some expectations that if you're going to a commercial establishment, you'll probably find it on the corner of a building. Generally, too, if it's on the corner of the street, it's really great. But if you are going to a school, kind of think main driveway. There are different routing modes I talked earlier about when we talk about routes. Pedestrian routes are made for distance. The device doesn't want you to walk any farther than you have to. And motorized routes are created for time parameters. How fast can we get you there? How can we route you to get you there quicker? Accordingly, all routes are not created equally. The route that you self-create going from point A to point B, whether it be from your driveway to the mailbox or down the street 2 doors to get to Mabel's house or 3 blocks away, if you have self-created that route and GPS has recorded your every step, that is the most reliable route you can have. Going to a landmark or finding a waypoint, if you reset it as a destination, is going to give you a little less reliability than self-created routes. Generally, you're talking about 15 to 20 feet before it rings you up. Points of interest, plus or minus 50 feet. And sometimes it could be a bad day, it might ring you up even further off. And the worst for reliability is address entry, because GPS simply guesses. What it does is says, well, blocks are 25, 50, or 100 in our environment, and if the number is 1082, it will tell you that you are on that end of the street. But it is not real definable. So it could ring you up at least or more than 100 feet away. GPS is not perfect. Remember, we are getting that source of information from 12,000 miles above Earth. So sometimes that signal slows as it passes through the atmosphere. You have problems with number of satellites that are visible. In the old days, the GPS would tell you that you have 6 satellites watching you or 4 satellites, and students would get very concerned that they were not having a good day traveling because only 4 satellites were watching them. Now GPS just says low, medium, and high, which is much easier to work with. But the number of satellites visible, the terrain, electronic interference, or sometimes if you're walking under heavy foliage, can block GPS signal. One of the main problems that you have when you are in large cities is what is called signal multipath, and that's where the GPS signal is reflected off objects such as tall buildings or large rock surfaces before it reaches the canyon. In GPS parlance, we call this the canyon effect. And one of my most difficult days teaching GPS was teaching it in downtown Chicago, because we had to reset our GPS position with our device a number of times because we were getting multipath bouncing signals, and the canyon effect made for a very difficult day. When we are getting information incidentally that GPS provides us as we walk through the environment, what happens is that incidental learning gives us control in the environment. I say that the incidental information results in incidental learning and control. We develop our perception of environmental literacy of that environment. So it gives us as my advisor in graduate school called it, the gestalt of the environment. We kind of get a feeling for the whole thing, knowing how many things are being announced to us. Incidentally, we are not accessing that, although we can. It automatically announces that information. We always have to remember that our students learn from part to whole. So if I'm getting a number of stores, POIs, landmarks being announced to me, I then can piecemeal together all of those things so I develop the scheme of that environment, therefore increasing my environmental literacy of that environment. Problems, problems, problems. We always have problems with technology, part and parcel of what we do. So it is smart if you turn on the device before you go to work with a student, because that may be the day that you're standing there with a student, and being an O&M specialist, we have time limits on the amount of time we can work with a student. So if you are wasting it standing there, turning on the device and waiting for the satellites to download, your student will ask a couple things. A, is it always this difficult? And question, gee, this is really a neat device. It takes forever to download. And when I say forever, time is different. So therefore, your 2 minutes is nothing. Their 2 minutes is forever. So make sure that you turn on the device before you get there instead of wasting the time to get it going. I say that, but it generally only takes about 2 minutes, maybe 3 on a bad day, to get satellite reception. And then learn to use the resets. Learn to reset your GPS position when you're getting strange information. And you will get strange information sometimes. Learn to reset the device. We work with technology on a regular basis in the field of blindness and visual impairment. So learn how to reset the device, do it quickly, and teach your student, okay, what is the problem? Okay, reset the device. Don't hesitate. Don't wait thinking that, well, it'll get better, it'll get better. If you're getting screwy information, reset it. You will get what I call routing hiccups when you're out on the street, and that is when the device momentarily loses connection with the satellite. And so you may get no GPS coverage, or turn back, or off route. And I always tell my students, forget it. That is just noise, white noise out there that you're getting from your device. I always say, what did the device tell you to do initially? Okay, did it say walk north? Okay, are you going north? Yeah, we'll keep walking. When the device then asks you, you are off route, would you like to change the route? Then you confirm that with the device. But the other information, just simply chatter and noise. I was at a conference recently, and Dr. William Penrod from Northern Illinois University said something that was very, very profound when we talk about orientation and mobility. And he said, I have found over the years that the teaching of orientation and mobility is an art of accepting approximations. GPS does that. It gives you approximations. Remember, O&M is shoulders up. The brain is not in the cane. The brain is shoulders up, and we need to learn to think with that information, how are we going to use that information? It is all about the approximations to get an understanding of the environment. When we teach using GPS with orientation and mobility, we have to always understand that GPS usage demands solid fundamental O&M skills for the final plus or minus 50 feet. there is somewhat of a thought out in the education world that we can just take a device and give it to a student and all will be right with the world. Well, it's not that easy. A, you have to learn to use the device, then you have to learn how it interacts with the environment. So we have to teach those solid fundamental O&M skills for that final 50 feet to get to our destination. So we do that by practicing context clues and concepts over and over and over again. And earlier I talked to you about the odds and evens, east and the west, and the ascending and the descending. We need to have a clear understanding of those organizational parameters. If we don't have to cross a street to get to our destination, why would we? So it's very important that we do not make street crossings that are unnecessary. For I have often said that every street crossing is an adventure, and we don't want to have any misadventures while we're traveling through the environment. So really work with understanding those organizational parameters. Are the even numbers on the east side of the street or the west side? The north side or the south side? Do they ascend as I'm walking east, or do they descend as I'm walking east, or north, or south? Get a picture of those, of the environment, so it makes it much easier to travel when you're getting that auditory information. We must practice using time and distance as we travel through the environment, tying that together with our auditory information. If it seems too far, well, let's access our electronic information and confirm that. So we have to work with time and distance. Using GPS does not obviate good O&M skills. So we need to practice time and distance, solicitation of aid, and when we're out in the environment, don't tell your student answers. Ask them questions. Let them formulate the answers for you. It is essential that you preview routes for black holes. Many of us have cell phones, and we find that in some areas cell phone coverage is not so hot. Well, in some areas GPS isn't so hot either. So preview routes for those black holes out there where we're not getting great information, so that when you teach your student as they're going through the environment and you're getting that no GPS coverage, turn back, off route, you can work through those situations so that your student doesn't react. I've often taught my students what we want to do is respond to the information that we're getting, not react. Response and responsiveness and reaction, much the same thing but far different. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says you are responding to the medication, generally we think that's a pretty good thing. If he says we are reacting to the medication, it's really not such a good thing. So teach your students how to respond to the information, not react. And we learn to do that when we preview routes for black holes. Do not be afraid to take a cheat sheet on lessons and then use it. There's no shame in having that in front of you to make sure you're giving good information. Take the time to do it correctly and don't guess. Have that information. It is much easier to teach it correctly the first time than trying to unteach something to reteach something. O&M specialists are generally pretty hard on themselves and feel as if they can pick up a device and learn how to use it in 20 minutes. And I guarantee you, friends, learning how to use GPS and learning how it interacts with the environment is going to take you more than 20 minutes if you do it correctly. So don't be afraid to take a cheat sheet on your lessons and then use it. When I work with the Trekker Breeze, I have multiple SD cards for each one of my students. Therefore, they can plug that into the device and their landmarks, their waypoints, their routes are theirs. It's their device for the day, per se. They don't have to search through their classmates or other students' information to find the information that they need. And SD cards are not that expensive, and it makes it a whole lot easier when you're out working in the environment. Practice using the settings menus on all of your devices. All of them can be personalized for the traveler. Some students want that speech to be very, very fast, faster than even I can understand. Other students need it a little bit slower. So don't be afraid to go into that settings menu and practice changing it to work with the student, because that information will be retained and it makes it a lot easier for the student. Do not use earplugs or headphones when you're out traveling in the environment. I want my students listening to the auditory information, but I also want them listening to the ambient surrounding environmental information when they are traveling. And that would be a problem if they are using earplugs or headphones. Most importantly, when we teach GPS is you have to practice learning how to think without vision to effectively teach those without vision. When that cane comes in contact with a wall, don't tell your students, well, that's a building, what are you going to do? The student doesn't know that. They just know they're making contact with something. So learn to think without vision to effectively teach those without vision. In Kansas, we are bordered by the great state of Missouri. And the great state of Missouri's motto is show me. Showing is far better than telling. It's all about doing. In the picture I have on the screen, I'm showing a student where to place his finger to access information. I could tell him, but it's far better if I show him, and it cuts through the fog of learning much quicker. Encourage your students to borrow the devices that you have on weekends. They do the students no good at all sitting on your desk plugged into the chargers. So on weekends, many of my students borrow the devices and the chargers so they can use them when their families travel through the environment. And they learn more about the environment through getting that incidental learning. I've never had a device lost yet. They've all come back. It's never been a problem. When you're out with a student, intentionally try and get lost. Tell your student, the GPS says turn right. Tell your student, turn left. Let's see what it does. So that they can get practice understanding that if they do make a wrong turn, the GPS will bring them back and put them back on the road, demonstrating the utility of the device. Our students will always have somebody driving them. I say all. Maybe we will have some students that can drive, but many of our students will have somebody driving them through the environment. Or they will be on a bus that is taking them places and giving them sometimes GPS information on the bus, but many times with no information. So teach them motorized guidance. Teach them to understand what that information is that they are getting and how to use it. If they're on a bus, teach them to understand that the street before their stop is the one they need to be listening to, not the stop itself. If they are in your back seat and they are giving you directions how to get someplace, teach them how to access the route directions, because in the device they are listed just like they are in a Google map or MapQuest step-by-step directions. And by accessing one step ahead of where you are, you teach them how to be able to guide you through the environment. So they are not saying, as you are driving, Mr. Craig, we have to turn here, and you have to slalom 3 lanes across traffic. Much better for them to tell you as soon as you change segment, Mr. Craig, up here about 500 feet, you're going to have to take a left turn at Jones Avenue. Well, that works a whole lot better, so I can plan. Have your students show you and not tell you. Go back to that show me. Have them show you, and then have them in service their parents, their relatives, their teachers, and their classmates. Nothing is more enjoyable than having your student who is going to give his class a tour of the playground with the landmarks that he or she has put down on the playground, and give them a tour using the GPS, because it demonstrates that they have control in the environment and that they are competent travelers. When you work with the Garmin Oregon 450, you have to monitor glare interference. The student on the screen has a working distance of about 10 inches, and he has placed that device in a position that he can adequately read the screen. It's interesting that the student on the screen's father is a real estate agent, and on weekends they go out looking at homes that his dad wants to have or show during the week. This student enters the address information and guides his father to the individual houses. They work as a team, and the student is in control of the travel for the day, and he feels pretty good about it. Whenever we are in the environment, we have to think of the proximity paradigm. In other words, proximity is an abstract concept. Think about it. Your near, visually, as you look, is your student's far, because they have no idea of the distance. And your far, as you look on the horizon, is another universe for them. So whenever you're working in the environment with GPS and something is near, you have to consider the proximity paradigm to make it work for your student. There are many opportunities to tie together GPS information in the curriculum. It goes without saying that conceptual development is a huge key to understanding the world around us. There are many opportunities for literacy, both written literacy, reading literacy, and environmental literacy. Physical education has always enjoyed physical activities, and I have gotten many physical education credits for my students using the pedometer in the device and by charting that information. Geography goes without saying. We're in the environment, learning where things are, what things are contiguous to other. What does the environmental look like auditorily? And then mathematics, time and distance. How far have I walked? How fast have I walked? The devices will all tell you how far you've walked, how much further you have to walk to get to a landmark or a POI. So therefore you have built-in mathematics opportunities when you use GPS. And many times I tie together a student with low vision using the Garmin Oregon 450 and a student either using the Apex or the Trek or Breeze, and we do a dual lesson, and it develops social competency skills for both students. One of the smartest things we've ever done is my student started this when he was in 4th grade, and we determined we wanted to test the accuracy of GPS. So he started to use that as a science fair project. So in 4th grade, we charted from where a landmark was in open area to where it rang us up and told us the distance. We measured with a tape measure to where it told us the distance was. And we charted what the differences were and what the variance was. In fifth grade, we did it with a POI on the street. We'd use the post office on a corner, and we measured when we approached it from the west, from the north, from the east, and from the south. From where it rang us up to tell us we were there, to measuring with the tape measure what the distance to the actual destination. And he has been able to garner the blue ribbon at his elementary school every year using GPS. The GPS continuum goes like this. When you work with a student, in my case at age 5, we would walk outside and she was a little weirded out by getting that auditory information. And when I would ask her, where does that information come from? She always would point to the sky and say, outer space. It comes from outer space. She also knew that as she walked from her school to the street, she was heading north. She knew the street name in front of her school because GPS would announce that. She knew the streets on either side of the school because we walked to either one of them and GPS automatically announced it. And she knew that if she continued walking from her school and continued north, that she would be able to get to the North Pole. And she wanted to do that because she wanted to see Santa Claus. Did she understand the entire GPS concept? No. What she did was she was learning how to put together her world at that point. My student, who is age 7, was listening to his GPS device. It was the Trekker Breeze, and he had listened to it 3 times as his mother drove him home from school. And one day she decided to take a left turn to run an errand. And his exact words, because she told me this, were, "Mommy, we need to turn here." He had learned the route to his home through the incidental information that the GPS announced. Just the way we do it when we look out the car window and sighted individuals say, "Oh, there's that, there's this, I need to turn here." He was getting it auditorily, we get it visually, but it's the same incidental information. An adult friend of mine landed at an airport and had to get to his destination, and the cab driver was having difficulty getting to that spot, got lost, and my friend said, "May I give you directions from my GPS?" The cab driver reluctantly said yes, and partly because my friend, who doesn't have vision, said, "I'm paying for the ride, so therefore we are going to use my GPS, and I need to get to my appointment." So by using the GPS from the apex, he was able to direct his cab to the front of the building that he needed to go. He told me afterwards that directing a cab driver to my destination gave me control. 3 different positions on the GPS continuum: learning, using, and directing, and gaining control. A client of mine borrowed my Trekker Breeze, and she was using it on a regular basis as she came home, because previously she would get into a car and she would be driven home and she had no idea going from X to Y, the distance, the streets, what's out there. And she said to me afterwards, "I feel like I'm cheating somehow when I don't have to keep track of what street is what, where it's located, what direction I'm heading, etc. It frees my mind up to concentrate on other aspects of orientation." And then, listening to the GPS as I'm riding in a car, realizing the breadth of this world that is outside my car window, I have heretofore never gotten to interact with. Amazing. Simply amazing. And this is a dog guide user with a PhD from the University of Kansas who was 40 years old who gave me this information. This is my student Brooke. I work with her every week. She's my community familiarity environmental access, social interaction, GPS lesson. She sets landmarks, creates and completes routes, enters addresses, and directs drivers. She's 10 years old in this picture, and I would posit that she will be very prepared for the next level of her growth. So where are we going with wayfinding, GPS, getting through the environment? Well, we need a lot more research. Paul Poncilia's research talked about redirecting and finding ourselves in space and proved the value of GPS. Interior apps and exterior apps are kind of the flavor of the week, but we have to make sure that they are applicable to the traveler with a visual impairment. And we've really not seen anything different with devices in the past 10 years. We did have a voice-activated system that pretty much people tried and people bought because the cost was lower, but we've not had a great deal of success with it. So devices really haven't changed too much. And so as we go in the future, what's going to be important is getting tighter and tighter resolution for our travelers to get through the environment. My name is Craig Phillips, and I developed my own company called Craig Phillips Vision Services, LLC. I can be reached at 913-645-8262, or my email address is cleep1700@att.net. That is CLEEP1700@att.net. I'd like to thank you all for listening. I'd like to also thank, again, Dr. Ann Nielsen, who is in charge of the KANLOVKIDS Low Vision Project in the state of Kansas, for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today about a subject near and dear to my heart, and that is GPS and the traveler with a visual impairment. Thank you, and good day.